We are nearing the end of the SundaeSwap ISO era. And right about now, everyone is wondering if the ISO phenomenon itself and its stake delegation centralization effects will ever truly end, or if we'll just be stuck on a never ending hamster wheel of ISOs. But I think this intellectually neglects that we can already see two distinct types of ISOs that will exist. And the difference between the two may mean a win either way for all of us delegators. Ready? Let's go. Today, we will discuss the end of the SundaeSwap ISO era and what that really means, Ardano's ISO announcement, the future of the two types of ISOs, the BlockFi crypto lending settlement with the SEC and the states, and Hackernoon publishing a Cardano philosophy piece by a Cardano Stakepool operator on the nature of money. We have reached the end of an era. The final snapshot for the SundaeSwap ISO finally took place today. That means everyone can rapidly move back over to the single stake pool operator of your choice. But you already know that's not really the case. There's a caveat here. They're not quite ready to release you. Now we've got the reverse ISO. They've even already got a list. You probably already know the snapshot for this reverse ISO is February 19th. And if you move your stake from one of the original ISO pools to one of these single pool operators who got at least one vote in the initial voting for the ISO pools, that you'll get one more epic of SundaeSwap rewards. Of course, many people on Cardano social media today were just antagonized by the fact that the SundaeSwap ISO wasn't really over. There were going to be continued incentives for people to delegate their stake to stake pools at the direction of SundaeSwap, even though it was a much broader group of stake pools. And obviously, those are all single stake pool operators according to SundaeSwap. This announcement came on top of that, which probably also just made some people even more angry. Here is the Ardano initial stake pool offering announcement. And of course, Ardano, there's a lot of language in here about decentralization and effective K and minimum attack vectors and all the kinds of things that people are talking about a lot right now. But at the very start of the article, you also see that Ardano has its own list of stake pools. Here's a list from Ardano of the Ardano Stake Pool Alliance. And as we look at this, be aware, I hold Ardano tokens, and I also hold a right, of course, to claim some SundaeSwap tokens from the ISO over on the SundaeSwap side. Just full disclosure there. Obviously, this is a pretty big list. You know, this isn't an extremely small list, but it is a list. Stake pool operators as a group are pretty active on social media, so we're probably going to see a lot of chatter in the coming period about how we seem to be on some kind of never-ending hamster wheel of ISOs, whether they're called ISOs, ISPOs, fair ISOs, whatever they call them. They all seem to revolve around a given list of stake pools and all seem to result in some level of centralization toward those stake pools. And of course, every stake pool operator who's not on that list is going to be much more likely to be talking about the centralization effects of that particular ISO than anyone who is on the list. The easy logic question here is, hey, why don't they just end all this nonsense about who's on the stake pool list for each particular ISO, who's not, and just distribute out the tokens to all the delegators across the ecosystem, no matter what stake pool they're a part of? That doesn't happen because it doesn't suit the needs or preferences of each particular project, but it does bring up what I think is the question that maybe is going to save us either way. And that's, are we talking about ISOs where people are trading their staking rewards for the tokens of the project? Or are we talking about the other type of ISO where the project is just decentralizing and handing out their tokens and not taking the staking rewards of the delegators? I think this is a key difference. And this might be the one that actually saves us either way and is probably maybe more important in the long run than these revolving lists of who's a part of which ISO and who's not. The SundaeSwap ISO was huge. It was gigantic, and it did result in centralization of delegated stake. But here's the crucial thing. SundaeSwap wasn't really after our ADA, not in the ISO. Sure, you could argue that the initial ISO pools were the same as the scooper pools. So the ISO was like indirect incentivization of the parties running the offline pieces of the SundaeSwap protocol. You could make that argument. But SundaeSwap wasn't directly trading us ADA in exchange for their tokens. They were just kind of handing us the tokens for free. I'm going to use that phrase free tokens, even though you could make this argument about the incentivization of the scoopers because they were the same as the ISO pools. But we were basically getting these tokens for free. This is fundamentally different than a lot of the other ISOs we've seen. And I think a lot of the ISOs going forward, because people are going to want to use ISOs as capital formation techniques. They're going to want to accumulate capital for things like development and paying themselves and paying vendors, all the things that early stage projects do with capital, just like in the traditional world with VC money and seed money and everything else. I think we're going to see a lot of that in the future. I think the fact that these tokens were free was a huge part of why the SundaeSwap ISO was so big. You didn't have to give up your ADA rewards. You got to keep your ADA rewards and you got their tokens. So this was gigantic. Sure, there was all the other stuff. I mean, obviously, IOHK was talking about SundaeSwap because it seemed that SundaeSwap was one of the most involved with IOHK prior to the ISO. So we heard a lot. Everybody heard a lot about SundaeSwap from IOG and in all the AMAs and all that kind of stuff. Sure, that I'm sure that had an impact on how big this ISO was as well. But fundamentally, we were basically getting, air quotes, free tokens. Whereas in these other ISOs going forward, the temptation to use it as a capital formation process is, I think, going to be too much for most projects. I think with a lot of projects, they won't mention, hey, this is fundamentally different than the SundaeSwap ISO. They're just going to say, hey, this is another ISO. By the way, we're taking this much of your ADA. I'm sure this will not be the last sort of free token ISO we ever see, but this one was one of the first big, gigantic DEXs to launch. MuesliSwap beat SundaeSwap, but SundaeSwap was sort of the first that was really anxiously awaited by the community. That made the ISO bigger. IOG was talking about SundaeSwap. That made it bigger. But I think fundamentally the fact that it was free tokens made it huge. And I think in the future, we're not going to see ISOs thought of the same way. It was a pretty easy call. If you thought about, should I delegate to a SundaeSwap ISO pool or not? Pretty easy call. I mean, there were a lot of delegators out there who didn't delegate to the SundaeSwap ISO pools for various reasons. But I think for most delegators who didn't have some very strong connection or other reason for loyalty to whatever pool they were delegating to at the time, it was a pretty easy call to delegate over to the SundaeSwap ISO pools because it was free. But in the future, when projects are using ISOs as capital formation techniques, people aren't going to think about it as this easy, logical thing. All of a sudden, it's a matter of price. How much ADA am I giving up in exchange for the tokens of this project? How much will these tokens be worth down the road in my estimation? Is that worth giving up the ADA rewards? Because fundamentally, you're basically buying the tokens with your ADA rewards if you're in that genre of ISO. This is also kind of a win either way for the delegators type scenario, because let's say we do have a ton more of these big free token ISOs for projects that people actually care about, like the SundaeSwap project. If we have a ton of those, if we really are still on the hamster wheel of never-ending ISOs, and they're these big free token ISOs that are really easy for people to decide to join, like the SundaeSwap one, it's kind of a win for all of us as delegators because we're going to get all those tokens for free. But barring some sort of regulatory development that forces that result, I don't think that's the most likely future. I think the more likely future is that most of these ISOs are going to be the ones where the projects are trying to use the ISO for capital formation. And that's going to be a fundamentally different prospect for delegators. Delegators are suddenly going to be pricing out the ISO. How much ADA am I giving up in terms of rewards in exchange for the tokens of this project? You're going to have fewer delegators to that type of ISO. And it's not going to be, these aren't going to be these projects that we all saw building prior to the launch of Cardano smart contracts. This initial crop, of course, is going to have that first mover thing where all of us were so anxiously waiting. And then Alonzo, finally dropped. And then finally we got to this stage in 2022 where we could participate in these projects. There's going to be a little bit less of that hype in the future. I'm sure there'll be gigantic projects that will achieve a lot of hype, but on average, not all the projects are going to be like this. So I don't think the particularly convenient availability of ISOs in the Cardano staking system necessarily dooms us to a future of centralization. I think there were some peculiarities about this SundaeSwap ISO that created some exacerbated centralization of delegated stake. But I don't think every ISO going forward is going to be this perfect storm of first mover advantage and being mentioned so frequently by IOG and also being a free token ISO. We discussed for a long time on this channel how the SEC and the state securities regulators seem to really be after the crypto lenders. And now we see, and they were obviously after BlockFi. Now we see that BlockFi has agreed to a settlement with the SEC for 50 million and apparently with the state regulators for another 50 million, making 100 million total. It's important to note here that BlockFi is centralized. It's a lot easier and a much easier first step for these regulators to go after the centralized platforms that are doing things like crypto lending. We'll know they've really stepped into a brand new territory if they go after Uniswap Labs. You remember it was obvious they were looking at Uniswap Labs, and that was right around the time that Uniswap Labs took down their interface for the protocol. And suddenly they're like, oh, we don't even provide an interface anymore. Now you have to use an interface provided by a third party. We just created this decentralized protocol. If they go after Uniswap Labs, that'll be a whole new ballgame. Right now, they've just gone after a centralized entity. While one of the BlockFi founders apparently characterized this as BlockFi having achieved regulatory clarity and a path forward, SEC Commissioner Hester Peirce had different things to say. She seemed to indicate anything but regulatory clarity when she said BlockFi will not be allowed to take in any additional crypto from retail investors until the company has registered a new crypto lending product on Form S1. Getting an S1 to the point where staff will declare it effective is often a months-long iterative process. When crypto is at issue, the time frame is likely to be longer than it would be for more traditional filings. She says even assuming BlockFi perseveres and prevails in the S1 registration process, before it can restart its lending program, it has to leap through another regulatory hoop, the Investment Company Act. The commission has found that BlockFi operated as an unregistered investment company, yet BlockFi cannot register as an investment company since it issues debt securities, and so it needs an exemption or exclusion. And then she talks about how one possible exclusion, the market intermediary exclusion, might be a difficult fit for BlockFi, and it's a rarely used exclusion. She calls it a challenging path to prove that it qualifies. So they're calling this a settlement, but maybe things aren't quite so settled. Finally, strap on your Steven Seagal ponytails. We're going to do some Robert Breedlove crypto philosophy stuff. Actually, we're not, but Core Stakepool did. So Core Stakepool wrote this article, Why the Real Definition of Money Explains the Rise of Cardano, and it looks like Hackernoon published it. So they've also got a video here that goes through the same material, but I believe the article goes into a little bit more detail. They say the Bitcoin maximalist Robert Breedlove has a podcast called The What is Money Show. He defines money as a medium of exchange. And then down below here, here's their sort of addition to that. They say, even though it is true that we all use money as a medium of exchange, we have forgotten the other vital half of the definition. Whether it's a relationship to your tribe or your king, history clearly shows that the value of money is rooted in relationships. They say Robert Breedlove's definition of money is built on the wrong assumption. We didn't invent money to replace bartering as a medium of exchange. They think it's really rooted in relationships. Very interesting premise. The video is good too. I would definitely check these out if you have a couple of minutes, either the article or the video. I hope you had a great Valentine's Day. Either you did something fun, or at least you didn't make any significant other angry by giving them the wrong type of gift. And I will talk to you tomorrow.